the immediate level that we always need to think about it as anthropologists is what we incite in our participants, in our interlocutors, especially in the early stages. And I already kind of tended to induce certain reactions with these kind of stereotypes. So you probably don't have problems with individualization or with following your free will, because in your society, probably it's not an issue. I mean, of course, the differences are not completely unbased. I mean, these evaluations, but they kind of exaggerate and also lead people to try to emphasize perhaps certain things.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality on Future Frame TV, brought to you by Traces&Dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and I'm joined today by Dr. Gil Hizi. Welcome.
Hi, Paul. Good to be here.
I think I mispronounced that surname. I needed to put more emphasis on the H, didn't I?
No, it's okay. You're getting closer.
We'll work on it. I'll work on it. You can just correct me. Before we launch in, tell me a bit about yourself. What brought you to the topic of ambiguity? We're going to be talking a little bit about this edited volume, the Anthropology of Ambiguity, and I'd like to know what brought you to that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think ambiguity is very relevant to any decent anthropological work. I mean, as anthropologists, we kind of take models that we see in anthropology or political science or sociology. And I think for many of my colleagues and for myself as well, once you enter the field, you see that, the difference. I mean, difference is something that we emphasize in anthropology. Usually we talk about cultural difference, right? And you see in the field that difference always also happens in different scales. So difference from one day to the next, different from one institution to the next, different from one field to the next, I guess we will talk a bit more about this soon. So, I mean, my focus initially, I studied psychological services in China and then programs for psychology and personal development in China. And I just saw that the outcomes of these or the effects of these programs, these activities, very vary across different settings, across different fields. People might try to emphasize one objective at one situation, but then have to adapt to another objective, to another requirement in another situation. So that's where I kind of saw these different evaluations, positions that people take, and that also makes their life overall much more, or their project much more ambiguous in practice. So it was kind of a natural fit for my thoughts.
Very interesting. Well, then let me just launch in with the question, what is normal?
So if we're talking about young adults in China, and I mean, most of my work started with young adults, like 8-9 years ago. I would say that normal is always striving to improve yourself, to develop yourself, but always having to juggle between different requirements, different inputs, different moral prescriptions, and always trying to be alert to changes in these requirements. So it's kind of this project that you need to improve yourself, and that's something that I guess we can relate also as people of other societies. But there is a very strong also tradition of self-improvement in China, as many people know, but also a lot of confusion, moving between position and trying to figure out what it means. And
you've really thrown me a curveball. I was not waiting for that answer. Normal has become constant self-improvement and continual adaptation to shifting contexts.
And I can add another layer that along with this adaptation, there's also some frustration about that work that needs to be put. People do still maintain some ideas or fantasies that there would be a one kind of model, one coherent model that would bring together more holistically the different contexts. But that's
I,
difficult to achieve anywhere, and especially in China, I would say.
I think the idea that normal is a constant state of frustration is probably going to appeal to a lot of listeners. But that's an interesting case that you're looking at here. You're looking at the concept of ambiguity, and here I am asking you about normality, and you're looking at it in the context of China,
Hmm.
which probably has a very certain flavor to it as well. Can you tell us more
Hmm.
about the Chinese context of these questions?
You're talking about the ambiguity specifically, or
Yeah,
uh,
so the way in which these questions would be interpreted in this case would
mm,
be attuned to your field site. And
hmm,
so
yeah.
maybe if I was to break it down more simply, just tell us about your field site and
Mm, yes. So the main project on which this chapter builds on is a project in three different programs for personal development for young adults. And we're talking mostly about what we call soft skills, interpersonal skills, strong influence of positive psychology. So one program was more of university students, one was a public speaking club for young adults, more middle class young adults, and one was more a psychology center that also trains psychologists, but also has many different activities for newcomers, focus, yeah, communication skills, emotional expression, and all sorts of activities that are also very common in Sydney and elsewhere. There is a certain impetus to embody kind of this new or this type of persona that has a certain emotional capabilities, strong individualistic undertones in terms of kind of identifying the inner self, identifying the consistent, unique self. And by this, also trying to see yourself as more than the social roles you undertake. So in psychology, it will be often majority of women also who are married or mothers, and often would be to see yourself more as a mother or as a child to your own parents or as a wife or as an employee and so forth. So, I mean, it also applies to men in different situations. So this impetus to see yourself as more the kind of these roles or the sum of your roles even. And part of it is also, I mean, there is frustration in this process, but there's also some optimism. I mean, there's also some optimism in the sense that maybe one day our society would be supposedly something different. So some people see their society in China as too traditional or too conservative or too relational, some cliches that people also really experience in different situations in social life. And part of what they imagine as an ideal, let's say, normality would be uh, a situation where they feel first more consistency across the different contexts, but also more being able to realize this kind of individualistic or more self-realizing inner self orientation across different fields. Of course, that also may vary in situations where this is more downplayed. I mean, people still want to be good children to their parents, as the chapter that I wrote emphasizes, or want to be good students, or want to be many different things that kind of carry a different logic, but this is still something that is interesting to see.
in your chapter, you draw upon Foucault's notion of governmentality, and I think
Mm-hmm.
Foucault's an interesting theorist to think about in relation to this topic because
Mm-hmm.
he talks about the drive to conform and that
Mm-hmm.
the drivers used to be quite harsh and violent, and that those extreme measures to drive conformity by using the whip have changed to
Mm-hmm.
creating more positive drivers of conformity, which is people aiming, striving for a certain goal. And the idea of self-cultivation taps into that. Can you explain that a
Absolutely.
little bit more for us?
Yeah, I think we can also talk about my attitude and usage of Foucault as ambiguous to add another layer of ambiguity in this chapter. I mean, I think it's very useful to Foucault or some of the people who developed this theory, like Nicholas Rose and others. It's very useful to think about personal development as a project that's more self-enterprising, right? In a project that you have more room to decide and to pick and to develop what you see as the ideal person. And it's not, sometimes it's still very imposed in citizenship, certain requirements of citizenship, certain limitation of citizenship that are very prevalent, of course, in China. But of course, there's room in these activities to first decide what you want to be as yourself or what kind of qualities to experiment with. And second, also these activities inherently emphasize the impetus of self-improvement, right? So that's why I think these activities in psychology and soft skills are so interesting, because they don't just develop a specific skills, they also kind of celebrate the priority of self-improvement altogether. So I think here definitely this kind of self-enterprising imperative or impetus is very apparent. So I think it's very important to identify kind of the emphasis of the trajectory that Foucault is describing in these activities, especially when we're talking about self-improvement in societies that are more privatizing market societies, which I would say China is. The only thing I would say is that some people have used this theory in a sense that that's the new citizen, or that's that person throughout society, or if we see people doing this in one context, it means that that's it kind of generalizing as a the new subject of China, for example, or a new subject of, and that's where I'm kind of saying, okay, yes, but there are also some contradiction, and there are also some situations that people don't feel that this kind of freedom or the enterprising potential and so forth. So just to be kind of aware of the variations. That's
You bring up Henrietta Moore's concept of the multiply constituted
Mhm.
subject, and I think in the West we often you think of the self as a single thing, as one
Mhm.
single bounded entity. How does your research experiences and this concept challenge that?
Yeah, so I think Moore's concept also kind of emphasizes the changing positionality, but more through the relationship, which I think that's a very important aspect to it. One level, the immediate level that we always need to think about as anthropologists, is what we incite in our participants, in our interlocutors, right? So that's also always something that I would see. I mean, I often enter the field, uh, especially in the early stages, and I already kind of tended to induce certain reactions, which was more, oh, Gil, you probably don't have this problem of being too filial to your parents, because in your society, probably people leave the house when they're 18 and they do whatever they want and never need to think about their family again, So these kind of stereotypes. So you probably don't have problems with individualization or with following your free will, because in your society, probably it's not an issue. So I mean, of course, the differences are not completely unbased. I mean, these evaluations, but they kind of exaggerate and also lead people to try to emphasize perhaps certain things. So always assuming I'll be very supportive and maybe and of self-improvement or of psychology or of capitalist developments and so forth. So I mean,
Those assumptions are kind of revealing, right? Can we just
mhm.
like if I was to ask a really basic question here, what are the challenges that they are voicing in their own context by projecting the idea that you don't face those challenges? What are the challenges that they are experiencing? And
Yes, I mean, so for example, the program for university students that's where it's very pronounced, and there's kind of this idea university students in China, their whole life are very focusing on self-discipline, succeeding in the college entrance exam, which is a very big thing in China and a very big social topic in general beyond the student community or the educator community. So this idea that people don't have the time and the luxus and the opportunities to actually think what I really want, who I really am, what I really want to pursue, perhaps taking a gap year, perhaps trying something different, perhaps not going to the best university that you could, but goes into the university that fits certain interests that you have more, or things like that. So many people. But what's interesting in China is that this criticism is very widespread. So the fact that university students, I mean, they are into that path, but there's a room to reflect on that path at the same time. So, I mean, what I'm saying now, it's points of criticism that I believe that most people in China are very familiar with and very hear it a lot and read about it in newspapers and in TV shows. So it's kind of interesting how there's this kind of very paved path that causes frustration, but there's also a lot of public debate about it at the same time. So that's something. So students is one thing, and again, there's the key tropes I think would be students, would be familial life, filial piety in China, which is a strong emphasis, which has changed throughout the years, but also with the one-child policy, it also gained another dimension and emphasis when people are single children. Now that changes back a bit in families that have more than one child, because if there are fewer children, then there's more burden on the single child to take care of their parents or to maintain a good relationship with their parents, and so that creates another emotional charge to that relationship.
Having siblings to begin with distributes that responsibility a bit, does it? Or
yes, I mean, in the past, of course, it was also a key virtue in Chinese society, but today I would say yes. I mean, having that responsibility as a single child is also something demanding emotionally. I mean, it depends, of course, on the family, but so that kind of added a new meaning to filial piety. So yeah, I mean, that's something that many people are concerned about. And, you know, some people talk about social hierarchies, people talk about the concept of guanxi, which relationship with this kind of social networks that can mean different thing to different people, but usually it has a certain element of kind of hierarchical, reciprocal demands that you can't easily evade, you can't easily refuse. So there are different tropes that people tend to identify very strongly with the unique attributes of Chinese society and kind of see them as the main obstacles to self-improvement or to certain elements of self-improvement, if that makes sense. So
I'm interested in unpacking self-cultivation and self-improvement, self-actualization a little bit more, because it's interesting to see how the self-help industry in strongly capitalist societies has been recruited to further drive that capitalism. It's sort of, if you cannot overcome your own personal challenges, then that's an individual failing. And so, you need some self-improvement, you need some self-cultivation, you need to self-actualize. And it's interesting to think about that industry and the commodification of that industry in a Chinese context, where we imagine different drivers. And when I say we, I say people who are not specialists, people outside your field who are viewing this culture from an ethic perspective, from an outsider perspective. Can you unpack, like, is this self-improvement industry, is it being commodified? How is it being mobilized? And you're saying it's not just one thing, it's multiple things, and it's achieving different goals. And it's not necessarily, if I understand correctly, it's not necessarily even achieving the goals it sets out to target, but it might actually be cr creating something else.
I mean, self-responsibility is still a big thing, right? And it's still, I mean, with the privatization of the Chinese economy since the 1980s, so people are more responsible and are more accountable, right, for the outcomes of their lives. I mean, they're not subordinating to a work unit or a rural commune as in the past. They choose their spouses, they choose the study programs. Often they engage in the labor market, right? So there is much more room for choice and responsibility. So that's one avenue where we can see also different types of self-help practices come into play. So that exists. At the same time, there is also kind of social dimension to different practices of self-improvement. That's also where the state agent may be more present. So the idea that we're not just need to improve, allow individuals to have tools, but we also need to elevate society to a certain model of citizen. Okay, so in the 90s, there was a lot of talking about population quality, and also in the early 2000s, reforms in education that focus on education for quality, which was more about creating this new generation of people who are more creative, more open-minded, more have soft skills, perhaps, and are more enterprising and also more oriented towards a market economy in many ways. So, I mean, some of these qualities, we can also see them resonating in other places. There is the element of self-responsibility, but there's also the element of kind of improving the society along with kind of paths of privatization, urbanization, more middle-class culture, middle-class tastes, priorities. And psychology is not only psychology self-help is not only a tool kit, it's also a symbol of modernity in some ways, right? So the Chinese state and also took very drastic measures also to promote psychology in the new millennium, and also in order to be good in terms of ratio of counselor per capita, or things like that, which actually are markers for social development, which the Chinese state is very, uh, promoting and adhering to. So that's an element that's always present. But what's interesting in China is that most of my interlocutors, they're not blind to these layers. So they would say, yes, of course, for the state, it's important to have more this suzhi, the quality citizens according to their model. Of course, for the state wants to elevate society to a certain model of citizenship, and we're fine with that. But what we're doing is more focusing on ourselves rather than thinking too much about the macro dimension.
Okay.
So there is kind of this awareness that happens of these two layers.
You mentioned that self-cultivation is shaped by inconsistent standpoints and ethical requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that there are more variables being put into the mix for people, in the sense that there's an impetus to have to improve yourself. And when I say that, I'm also thinking there must be some impetus to forward your career, forward your status in society, but also all the old imperatives are still there. The imperative to look after your parents, the imperative to look after your community. Are these in conflict with each other? Are people resolving those conflicts? And are there some novel insights that you've gained from observing and interacting with people in navigating those situations?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of trying to find out the different paths and different avenues to reach kind of this goal of personal development, which in itself is somewhat unclear sometimes, but there's a lot of running around between different activities, between different. So there is of course the impetus for career development, but that's also something that's not always certain. And for example, there's the kind of a very big exam for civil servants that people can take during their studies and later the higher education. And that's a path that is still prestigious and ensures stability and ensures lifelong employment, more or less. So some people would take it, but there's also a lot of kind of criticism and cynicism towards that, because that's kind of the old China. That's a China of people who are less have this drive to take risks and find new opportunities. So that's an example of something that I heard in the spaces that I did not hear, mostly criticism of that path, but then many people end up choosing that path because it ensures stability, which is also a good thing, right? And it's they make their family or their communities proud in some cases. And so, I mean, these are kind of things that people need to reckon with. And sometimes it's also a matter of different life stages where you can be more experimental, certain life stages where you need to prioritize stability. Obviously, there's also gender differences because there's some jobs and that are state jobs and jobs as educator that are more designated for women still today. So, I mean, there are kind of these junctions that are always at play.
This aphorism from Vincent van Gogh keeps on coming up in my mind. I believe he said that normality is a paved road, but no flowers grow on it. And I want to use that as a prompt because I want to prompt you to tell me what that looks like on the ground for people in China. And do you have any examples that you can draw upon in thinking in those terms from people's lives?
Well, I have one friend, a student whom I wrote in another article about, and I spent a lot of time with her in one summer. She was a master's student back then, and like every week we met in the market, and she always told me about a new internship project that she did, a volunteering in a big conference, translation program that she attended for the weekend, and it was always this combination of excitement and deflation that was very characteristic, because it was always, yes, this would allow me to develop the skills and my English skills and my public speaking, but there's always after a while like, yeah, but it didn't turn out as much as I hoped for it to turn out. At the end, I just did some logistical work or what did it all lead to? So there's kind of this combination of excitement, which we also need to acknowledge, the excitement, the opportunity, not just the frustration. So that's one example. I mean, elsewhere.
Hold on to that for a moment.
Yes.
It's so fascinating as an example because there's this promise of things are going to get better. If you do this internship, this volunteering opportunity, if you engage in this workshop, you're going to be able to use this as a stepping stone for something else. But then the excitement shifts to deflation or a different emotion. And it sounds like in this situation, this master student was being presented with a constant flurry of conflicting information and investing emotional energy as well as intellectual energy into those pursuits, and then going, oh, that was a whole bunch of sunk costs. Next. What sense do we make from that? What can we pull away from observations like that?
Yes, I mean, the flip side is that there are designated times in the end of your bachelor or master studies where people have the time. They're still officially a student, but they have the time to experiment with it. So that's also perhaps gives it some kind of legitimacy as a kind of life stage of experimentation and also and also perhaps the state trying to reduce unemployment levels by keeping students as students for a bit longer. But yes, I think it just these different paths, the different kind of few projections on the future. I mean, will we be a society that's more dominated by business pursuit, where the state sector would be smaller, and that's where, if we really want to be successful or exemplars, we need to pursue? Or do I want to work in an international organization, which is where perhaps the best place to do some political international connections and so forth? Language. Is English actually important? I mean, everybody that I meet in China, oh, I need to improve my English, or I'm so ashamed of my English, but is it really that important for Chinese people to speak English? I mean, it is in some ways if you want to be aware of some information, but there's also a question. I mean, a lot of work to put in something that's, and so in some for some careers you would need, for some careers you won't. So I think there's always questions about skills and trainings and pathways, and part of it is trying to guess what will come next, which in recent years becomes even more difficult to guess, with all the
Interesting.
turbulences and COVID and so forth.
I'm very much sold on the idea that that one interpretation of what normal is this constant pursuit of self-improvement, coupled with this constant drudge of being compelled to engage in these kinds of activities, and then how much energy and emotion do you put into it before, is this going to be just a bunch of sunk costs that I'm investing in each little project along the way? And how much do I allow myself to be pulled in this direction while I've also got all these competing responsibilities that are burdening me as well? And so it leads me to ask you, what questions should we ask about these conflicting stimuli?
Well, I think as anthropologists or as social scientists, we just need to always be aware of these variation and try to consider them in our outputs, I would say. And I would, yes, just to be attuned of the specific field. And I would say, I mean, as an anthropologist, as somebody who didn't grow up in China, obviously, I mean, it's also interesting to see what elements of that we can apply or think with when we think about other societies. I mean, you work in Australia. I did my PhD in Australia. I mean, just like you said, the self-improvement industry is very different, but some elements might still be the same. I mean, some people in Australia do care about their family and respecting their parents, right? Some people do have some obligations and things that are enforced on them by the workplace or by certain institutions, right? There are also elements of some hopes about more still social development and an ideal of citizenships that are also evident there. So I think that it's also good to kind of always go back and forth with different case studies and see what we can take, what might be some of our blind spots, and if when we're talking about personal improvement or other practices that are comparable on a more global scale.
Blind spots are a hard thing to become aware of, and
yeah,
although
for all of us, yeah.
Dr. Gil Hizi, thank you so much for your time today. And thanks for joining us on Idioms of Normality on Future Frame TV, the collective
pleasure,
podcast
Paul.
series
Thanks.
of Traces&Dreams.
Hope to talk again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.